Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar. My name is Luke Bader. I am the Director of Membership and Programs at the FAIR Institute, and I'm very excited for the first of this webinar series with our kicking off in our new research department and one of our new work groups, our Gen AI work group today, to introduce themselves to you, talk a little bit about the research that they've begun so far this year, their plan going forward, and hear some feedback from you all about your experiences, answer any questions you may have about what's going to be coming from the work group, and what they've seen in the industry so far when it comes to AI, and really discussing the future of AI risk management as we see it from the FAIR Institute. So we're going to be doing a deep dive there, answering a lot of questions and hearing some good things and use case studies from the team. Before I introduce the team and turn it over, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items here today. We have a full hour here scheduled. We will get through as many questions as possible throughout the presentation. Please put them into the Q&A module. I'll be moderating them, and we have time at the end to do a little bit of Q&A with our full panel here. So throw them into the Q&A throughout the presentation again, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. This webinar is being recorded. Tomorrow, or later today or tomorrow, I will post this in the member resource library section with a copy of the slides as well. So if you miss any part of it, or you want to go back to this afterwards, or you want to share with any of your colleagues, no worries. It will be up in the FAIR Institute resource library for members by the end of the day tomorrow at the latest. So it is being recorded, and no worries there. So we have 3 distinct members of our work group today presenting for us. And I am going to turn it over to them now, and I will mute myself. And we will start with Jacqueline Lebo, who is Risk Advisory Manager at Safe Security, to kick us off. Jackie, go for it.
Thank you, Luke, for the great introduction. So thank you all for attending our first AI work group webinar. I'm Jackie. I've been doing FAIR now for about 7 years. Most of my experience has been in the healthcare sector, specifically clients in the healthcare sector. But over the last few years, I have become heavily immersed in AI and looking at quantifying AI risks. So very excited to be working on this group with these other 2 really bright individuals on the panel today. So Arun, I'll pass it over to you to do a quick introduction.
Thank you, Jackie. Hello, everyone. My name is Arun Pamalapati. I am Senior Staff Security Field Engineer at Databricks. I've been doing data and AI for the last decade, and primarily I've been focused for the last couple of years on AI security, and excited to be part of this AI work group, FAIR Institute, and looking forward to this session. And now I hand it over to Brandon Sloan.
Hi, Brandon here. So I actually have most of my experience in banking, financial industry, cybersecurity stuff there. So I was thinking about this, and I spent 17 years working doing financial industry, and then the last 2 years in technology companies, so social media type stuff. But as an introduction, I was thinking about this on the drive in this morning. I have degrees in math, business, and cybersecurity. And when I think about risk quantification, and specifically AI and cybersecurity risk, it seems like the perfect intersection of all 3 degrees.
Yeah, it just took you 17 years to figure it out, right, Brandon? Awesome. Thank you guys for doing a quick intro there. So I'm going to jump into our agenda today for you guys. And just walk you through what our roadmap looks like. So we'll start with introducing the FAIR Institute AI work group, kind of what our vision is, what some of our objectives are as a group. We'll talk about our members. This will be probably the quickest slide we talk about today because we've already introduced half of them. We're going to talk a little bit about some 2024, 2025 initiatives we're looking into, but would love to hear from you guys. If you have any suggestions, feel free to throw them in the chat throughout our webinar today, or even email us. We'll provide that email towards the end of the webinar. We'll talk about some recent AI events and our perspective on them and why FAIR is relevant to the conversation. Brandon will walk us through a little bit of materiality of the model and development risks, And then, as Luke said, we will have like an open QA session at the end. If we didn't really mention a topic and you were interested in hearing kind of how we're approaching it, or what resources we would point to you, feel free to throw that type of question in the chat as well. So without further ado, let me move on to the important stuff. And I will pass it over to Arun to present the vision.
Yeah, quickly. So at Fair Institute, our vision is to accelerate the adoption of Gen AI by businesses and individuals with confidence, so that you can build by risk-informed decisions and making and help harness the enormous power of AI technologies. Right. So go ahead, Jackie. Go through some of the objectives and research that we've been working on.
Yeah, obviously we have this massive vision here to really get risk-informed decision-making as a part of generative AI adoption within organizations. We've seen people on a huge spectrum. We see people jumping into it feet first, like they've already built their own LLMs. And then I see people on the other end of the spectrum that are like very hesitant, are worried about stepping in because of some of the things we'll discuss later on today. So in order for us to achieve this obviously monstrous vision, we have some objectives. We want to enable that risk-informed decision-making in Gen AI with the right standards, frameworks, tools, and expertise. And Arun will talk a little bit about that later. He has already published some work through Databricks with the DAS framework. And we've also, through the FAIR Institute, published the FAIR Air playbook on how to quantify AI risk. We also want to collaborate with industry bodies like NIST, MITRE, and EU to complete their work with risk-driven thinking. So obviously, whenever these bodies are coming out with information, a lot of it's just like if you're talking MITRE, it's threat-based. If you're talking NIST, it's very controlled-based. And we want to ensure that risk-informed thinking is a part of that whole experience. And then to educate and support the FAIR community on this topic. So again, this is why we keep saying, if you have a topic, if you have a question, please post it in the chat. Send us an email, because we want to be able to provide any resources that we have available to all of you. That's the whole point of the FAIR Institute, is for all of us to share. All right, so now that I've talked a little bit about our vision and our objectives, let's talk about our members. So far the work group's been a little bit small. We kicked it off earlier this year with myself, Arun, and Brandon being on this webinar today. We have 2 additional members that attend regularly. Pankaj Goyal, he's the Director of Research and Standards at the FAIR Institute. And then we also have Omar Khawaja, he's the Field CISO at Databricks, working with Arun, really big powerhouses in the risk industry, trying to figure out AI just alongside all the rest of us. And potentially you. If you're interested in joining our AI work group, this is open to the FAIR members. So you can email memberservices@fairinstitute.org if you're interested in joining, and they will get you in contact with us so we can kind of include you in some of our meetings. We meet pretty regularly on a variety of topics, and we have a lot of things we're trying to plan out. Okay, so next we're just going to chat a little bit about what we've done so far this year and what's planned. I'll walk us through a little bit through what we've done so far and then hand it over to Arun. He's going to talk a little bit about the risk and controls, how he's approached that from a Databricks perspective. But starting out, obviously today we're having our introductory webinar, which is really fun. We're excited to introduce this group to the public and try to get more engagement. And last week, we also published what's new about generative AI risk blog post. Please check it out if you have not. It's in the FAIR Institute blog section. It should be right under some of like the newer blog posts. But if you have a question about where that is available, again, feel free to email us or put a question in the chat and we can kind of publish that out. So on to future topics. Arun, do you want to talk a little bit about how you've looked at controls so far from a Databricks perspective?
Yeah. So at Databricks, we have over 10,000 customers who are doing data and AI using our platform. As AI became more prevalent in their organization for the last 1.5 years to 2 years ago, when AI was picking up, customers started asking us some of the some of the questions around the risks involved with AI and some of the concerns that they have. So at Databricks, we worked with our customers, especially the security teams at our customers, to really understand what their concerns are, how they're using AI, and and we also studied some of the standards that are out there that are coming out, are that were already published, like in the form of MITRE Atlas or WASP LLM Top 10. We took those into consideration and wanted to really help our customers by putting the overall comprehensive risk by cataloging those risks as a white paper. So we cataloged about 55 risks for our customers so that they can clearly understand the risks that as they deploy AI, they can really understand where those risks are coming from, in what part of their architecture they should be thinking about when they think about risks, and what kind of risks that they should be really addressing based on how they deploy their AI, right? And then we didn't want to leave by cataloging the risks. We provide them a platform that is actually going to help them mitigate those risks. So we wanted to map those risks to mitigation controls using some of the capabilities that we have in the platform. But we also wanted to be helpful to larger communities. So when we put together the controls, we wanted to provide a generic set of controls that any customer, not necessarily just Databricks customer, can deploy or reason about. And if they are Databricks customers, we wanted to provide them with specific documentation links and so on and so forth. But more importantly for this group, since we released that framework, there has been huge interest in actually doing self-assessments of those their own deployments. So we've been helping our customers and learning risk quantification by using this framework, right? And providing customers with how to mitigate those risks and how to reduce the risk, risks that they're pertaining to their business. So that's where I think we'll be in the future diving, kind of deep diving into the specifics and how customers are using the framework, and with FAIR, how we are partnering in that process, and how anybody in this institution can learn from some of the lessons that we got from the field.
Yeah, that's super interesting too there, Arun, because I'll say why I love the Databricks framework. One, this is something you can just go on the Databricks website and get access to. It's not like you need to be a Databricks customer. But in order to quantify AI risk, you have to actually be able to identify it, right? So this is that great first step to kind of help you figure that out. But I'll hand it back over to Brandon to kind of chat about the next couple.
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting about this initial inventory of risks and controls is it gives us kind of a ground framework to start to have this conversation of what are we worried about? What are the things that we should be thinking about implementing to manage those things? And then when we layer on top of it the FAIR methodology, and particularly some of the new framework addendums like FAIRCAM, we can start to think about how these controls work together and quantify these risks. And so, building on the work that Databricks has done, it's going to be really interesting over the coming months to see how we use something like FAIRCAM and figure out, what are variance controls and what are decision controls in the context of AI. And so trying to apply these FAIR methodologies to the AI space is going to be really fascinating, and we're hoping to be able to produce some useful insights there. Now, obviously, once we have some set of risks and controls, the next question is always, well, what do I prioritize? What do I go after? How much is good enough? And those sorts of questions. And so where we want to go next is starting to think about this AI risk strategy, or a risk-informed strategy. And I know we're saying proper here, but just thinking about the sorts of things that you should be layering into your decisioning, how you make these decisions, where organizations can benefit from addressing multiple risks with single implementations of controls or control enhancements. So building on the risk and control framework, understanding. We're trying to drive some sense of like, how do we drive strategy at a higher level? And how do we think about AI risk more holistically? And then, of course, the follow-up question to that is, when do AI risks become material? And so there's this whole materiality question that's entered into the conversation within the last couple of years. And we'll actually have a little bit of a conversation about that in later slides. But understanding what AI risk means from a materiality perspective and the different dimensions there is going to be really interesting. And then, finally, from a CISO perspective, understanding liability, that's, again, an extension of this materiality conversation, this AI risk strategy. And so all of these topics are intended to kind of build on each other and try and paint a more fulsome picture of how we think about AI risk and how we quantify it and how we speak about it in consistent terms.
Yeah. And they all build to FairCon 24. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation, but we're hoping to have a large presence at FairCon. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, like I said, we'll have a slide towards the end of the presentation that talks a little bit about it. And we have Luke on here too that can help answer questions around it. All right, so I'm going to move on to some of our recent topics. And I'd say like the recent topics are large regulatory presence because that's really what we're where we're trying to mine data from and kind of understand risk from that perspective right now, is understanding what way regulators are going to do. So the first case I'm going to talk about is the Rite Aid case. And this was a case where Rite Aid deployed biometric technology to find shoplifters within their stores. So it used like facial recognition to scan shoppers as they came into the store in order to identify shoplifters. The FTC found they did not do their due diligence and monitoring required to deploy the AI technology. The FTC also found the algorithm was biased, particularly against people of color and women. And why this is like a problem to begin with, before we even get into kind of what the FTC settlement looked like, is from the beginning, like this isn't generative AI, but this is AI technology. But you can already tell that the fact that the technology was deployed and there was obvious bias, the proper like testing particularly likely had not occurred in order to keep this specific technology from having that bias effect and to kind of identify that ahead of time. What ended up coming out of this is the Rite Aid had been banned from using AI for use of surveillance for 5 years. Why that's relevant is they spent a lot of money on this AI technology and now they can no longer use it for 5 years. And in the meantime, they're going to have to actually like work on redeploying this technology as well if they plan on continuing to use this type of use case in their stores. And it's actually spurred other actions from other regulators because of this specific use case, right? Along with being banned from using AI technology, Rite Aid is also required to implement a robust information security program, which must oversee the company's top executives. I'd say from that perspective, what we're kind of seeing here is the FTC is drawing a really hard line in the sand that you need to do AI responsibly, and it needs to be risk informed, right? The fact that this was biased and one of the top recommendations is a robust information security program points to the fact that they want that all these AI technologies that are being deployed to be risk informed. From like a fair perspective, some information this case gives us to consider when we're quantifying risk. And I'll caveat this, that this is a little bit for people who have a little bit more knowledge of FAIR. But some potential losses can include reputation damage. This case got a lot of media attention, and there was a lot of response required from Rite Aid's perspective in order to respond to this. Legal fees associated with having to defend themselves in this case. The compliance fees with having to implement this robust information security program and probably continuously be audited over the next 5+ years by the FTC, and losses associated with the AI technology itself, right? It's not like they just deployed this in 1 or 2 stores. This was deployed in enough stores to get enough attention that it was causing some type of bias because of the way it was deployed. And I'd invite my other co-panelists to opine on this at all, and add any color to this about how they think that this kind of affects the AI journey that we're all on, right? Having this settlement. And it's okay if no one has anything else. I can kind of move on to our next use case as well. I can also invite the audience as well to ask any questions they have about the Rite Aid case. I'm also aware the slide's presenting a little bit weird.
Jackie, we do have one question that came up from Jennifer about curious to hear your thoughts on whether AI should be integrated into existing cybersecurity standards, or is it a separate AI security, or is a separate AI security policy necessary, or perhaps maybe a hybrid approach is best? So maybe get some responses from the group.
Yeah, I'd say in response to this, I think it's a two-pronged approach there, right? If you are using any type of AI technology, realistically, you should be incorporating that into your existing policies, depending on the use case. But at the same time, AI is it's a whole new technology in and of itself. So depending on how you're using it, you really should have probably some larger acceptable use policies in place for your organization that address that use. But that's my specific opinion based on some of the practice I had. Love to hear from Brandon or Arun on that as well.
Yeah, I can add to it. As we, Brandon was part of the white paper that we built. When we looked at the existing risks that are put out by various organizations, including MITRE Atlas or WASP LLM10, and our own customers and our own building that catalog. Once we built 55 risks out there, we looked at which ones are kind of fall into traditional cybersecurity and which ones are novel. There was about close to 25 of that 55 risks were traditional cybersecurity, and rest were all novel, right? So to answer the question about whether it should be part of cybersecurity, I think most of our customers see this as primarily cybersecurity. AI security would be part of the primarily cybersecurity. But I agree with Jackie that some of the skills that are necessary to address some of the adversarial machine learning or some of the novel ones, you either need to include rest of the other teams, which may not be part of your cybersecurity team, and overall address that comprehensively, because some of that goes into all the way to data poisoning and how the data is secured within the organization, and how the data is acquired, and legality of the data. So you would be looking at different stakeholders and including them as part of your process. But most of the time, one thing comes out very prominently in a given organization is that there got to be one set of team that is going to be ultimately responsible for, and that is considered to be the cyber or security team would be ultimately responsible for both the cybersecurity, adversarial machine learning, and responsible AI security combined together as part of the overall comprehensive approach for the security.
Yeah, so I think what I would add here is that the answer is going to depend on your organization quite a bit and your use of AI. And so just to kind of paint a picture here, there's probably a scale of complexity that an organization has between, on the one side, making use of available AI models such as a ChatGPT or something that is hosted externally, all the way down to building models and using them yourself for custom product integrations and custom purposes. And as you kind of traverse that spectrum, you need to think about how your organization is going to handle the various risks that those present. And there are different types of risks at different levels of implementation. And you're going to see those levels of implementation probably at all ends of the spectrum across your organization, depending on the business units and the various use cases. And so I I think, to circle back to the question, your policy needs to reflect all of that. And you may handle some of those use cases through your acceptable use policy, through your standard cybersecurity policies, but others you may need kind of a tearaway specific addendum to address. And one last comment on this, I have heard plenty of people make the comparison to public cloud and the movement to cloud and how we handled that in the early stages. And so you could probably draw some lessons on how we approach policy there as well, and think about, what did we do in the early stages? Maybe we started with a standalone policy around, cloud practices and secure cloud requirements, and then eventually folded those into our broader data security and other information security policies. So all of those are probably, good considerations and good lessons to pull from.
I see a few more questions around the Rite Aid case. I'll answer this one. I'll answer them in order that we received them. Does banned mean Rite Aid will be punished if future use is discovered, or does it extend to the AI product service provider also being punished for selling Rite Aid during the ban? So this specific use case is just around surveillance technology, and I will expand a little bit on the losses as well. It's not just that they are banned from using this, they actually have to delete the entire database that they created from the use of this technology. So if you think about that from a generative AI perspective, say you did not do something responsibly and you have trained a generative AI model and you received a kind of compensatory order from the FTC because you did not do it risk-informed way, you did not take a responsible AI approach, you could potentially have the same type of order where you have to delete entire databases of data used to train AI models and start from scratch, which is what Rite Aid is being forced to do in this case. I believe part of the order too from the FTC includes their bankruptcy order as well. I will say I don't have knowledge whether those are related, but if you want a link to the actual injunctive relief document, I'm happy to post it in the chat for anyone who's a little bit more of a law nerd like I am. Another question is, what triggered Rite Aid's investigation? Was it a lot of false positives? Yeah, so the part of the case was the fact that the people that were using this technology were just store workers, and they weren't necessarily being properly trained on it. So they were actually calling the cops in many cases. So there was a number of false reporting happening as well. I'm not sure what spanned the actual investigation and how many reports happened in order to get there. But it wasn't just the fact that they were using this and identifying people and kicking them out of the store. They were actually calling the police in many cases as well, whenever they identified them through this AI technology. Great questions, though, from the audience. And thank you guys also for the support on the question with the policies. I think it's important.
Before we move on from Rite Aid, I did want to call out one thing that maybe not be readily apparent in this case, and that's that AI risks change over time. And you may do your model risk assessments at launch, you may do your testing, your red teaming, you may check for biases during fine tuning and training, but then once you've released it and once you've got your production system online, you may find that the model drifts or that there are some unforeseen things that are creeping in. And so if you look at something like the NIST AI risk management framework, it has in there a bunch of call outs for continuous monitoring and measurement and managing for these AI risks over time. And so the temporality of AI risks is absolutely something that you need to bake in. And as a cyber risk quantification professional, our programs are not always set up to do this kind of continuous risk quantification. And honestly, the only way to really do that effectively is standing up data-driven technology and data-driven calculations and really thinking through how you're going to do that on a continuous basis. But that's something to really think about from an AI perspective, because it's a slightly different case from normal software. Normal code, you write it once, you push it, and then it stays fairly static. But with AI, the models can change over time and the use cases can change over time. And so it's definitely this temporality risk that kind of undertones the Rite Aid case, and something to think through.
Exactly. I see there's one more question around the Rite Aid case, and then we'll move on because I know we have a few other topics we want to cover. Did the court define what is the threshold for when the bias was too much triggering punishable bad practices versus just bad business? I believe it did. I personally don't have yet on me today, but I'm happy to post the court document for anyone who'd like to review that and understand a little bit more about what that bias looks like. I will say the bigger communication here isn't looking at the specifics of the Rite Aid case, like not saying like, oh, this is how much bias. I would take a risk-based approach to it based on your organization. So if you are deploying something that is very sensitive, like this type of AI technology that can identify people and identify them as shoplifters, and then you have to rely on people who are, cashiers in nature and, work in the storefront to deploy this type of technology, it needs to be much more sensitive than potentially deploying like a co-pilot internally to your organization where individuals can ask it questions about your HR practices and stuff. Those are two very different risks. So that's why it's really important to not necessarily focus on the specifics of the case, just take the key takeaways being that risk-informed approach and tailoring that for your organization. So I will move on to our next hot topic, which was the FCC's ban on the use of robocalls. So many organizations have taken to using AI to generate robocalls and marketing content as a first use case, and the FTC has actually banned this practice. What I would ask, though, whenever we're talking about ban this practice, are you using AI marketing tactics like cold calls? And are you taking a risk-based approach to evaluate your internal use of AI and marketing? So the FCC chairman, whenever they released this ban, again, this is another document that we'll be willing to post as, the original source, was bad actors are using AI-generated voices and unsolicited robocalls to extort vulnerable family members, imitate celebrities, and misinform voters. We're putting these fraudsters behind robocalls on notice. The TCPA also allows individual consumers, which is the act that empowers the FCC to make these type of bans, and organizations to bring lawsuits against robocallers in court. These two cases, the FCC has clearly drawn a line to the fact that they expect responsible and risk-informed use of AI. One good example of where this type of AI robocall makes sense versus where it doesn't is if, say, you're talking about your health insurance, and we know everyone has to kind of use this. Everyone has health insurance or has to work with it in some way, in some order or fashion, in order to, get their doctor's checkups. If you have use cases calling existing members with diabetes for diabetes-related treatment that are available through their plan, and you're using AI technology to do that, that doesn't necessarily fall into the same realm as if you have an AI robo cold calling unrelated to treatment, trying to sell a service, which would likely more fall into that FCC no robocall rule versus, targeted marketing campaigns, just letting members know about different products. But would be interested to hear from, other panelists or the audience, like what questions you guys have around this, and if your organization has been using AI in marketing and how you guys are taking a responsible AI approach to that.
So to
I'll give it a second.
Add to the question here, I think the copyright and content generation questions come into play here as well. If you are using generative AI in producing marketing material and then claiming that as your own, if it's not your model or if it's somebody else's, hosted model that you're using to generate this content, are you violating copyright laws? I think there's very much still gray areas here around legality as well. But it's part of this exposure that you're introducing when you introduce AI to these processes. And so figuring out one, is there a likelihood value here? And if there is there an impact value here? There's some unknowns in doing that calculation. And, unknowns are part of every new technology and every new use case. But as, our profession, we need to figure out how to put some boundaries around that and, come up with some kind of estimations. So it's an interesting question, to be sure.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some questions come in. I see one that says, looking ahead to vastly more sophisticated LLMs in the next 2 years, do we think this ban will likely change? I would say likely not. And my reason being is the ban was mostly put in place, I think, to empower attorney generals within states to be able to kind of target these people that are extorting family members and imitating celebrities and trying to cause large misinformation campaigns. It just has an additional impact that limits robocalling across the board. So I would say, because of how sensitive that issue is, I don't see this changing regardless of how sophisticated the LLMs get. But that's just my personal opinion of the matter. And Brandon, Arun, welcome you guys to kind of speak on that as well.
Yeah, I think, for now, the risk categorization is what it is. So is it harmful? Is it high risk? Is it low to medium risk? And is it no risk, right? That's what overall, is being addressed. At some point, maybe far in the future, as these things become more predictable, and also as a society, their own expectation and their own trust on these systems grow, maybe. But right now, I don't think we are going in the direction of changing based on next 1 year or 2 years is not something that I would say this would happen, but maybe in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
So is there a risk-based approach that companies can take to defining processes which should not or need to heavily restrict their use of AI?
Yeah.
And what does that look like?
Yeah.
I don't know. You guys tell us. I'd say, from my perspective, it's literally organization by organization, and it's just it kind of taking your organization's approach to whatever your product is, whatever you're doing, and keeping cybersecurity in mind, making sure your data governance team is in the loop, making sure your privacy team is in the loop. And if I didn't mention it, your cybersecurity team is in the loop, and kind of working together to kind of define what these acceptable uses, what these risk threshold definitions are for the use cases that you're looking to deploy. I don't know that there's necessarily one size fits all. I think that's why a lot of things like NIST AI, RMF, the EU Act, they don't give thresholds. They don't give direct guidance. They basically say, these are things that we know are bad, and these are things that we know are medium risk, and these are things that we know are likely okay uses, but make sure you're also evaluating it from your own organization's perspective. Speaking of the UAI Act, if there are no other questions on the FCC ban, I will move on to that. Cool. All right. So Arun and I are going to talk a little bit about the UAI Act, and I call it Not Your Mother's Acceptable Use Policy because when I first read it, I thought it was the longest acceptable use policy for AI I've ever read. But that was my first impression of it. So what this does is it requires all AI systems to be trustworthy and transparent with someone accountable for them. The Act classifies AI systems based on risk, high risk being most strictly regulated, and set requirements for developers and users. This really aims to minimize risk for AI while fostering innovation in Europe. They've kind of taken a stronger position than the FTC. They ban and categorize multiple types of AI use. I'd say from my perspective, the important takeaways from this for a risk practitioner, CISO, CRO, I'm sure we have a pretty wide audience on this call with different roles that I'm not mentioning, is requiring people to take that risk-based approach, which if you haven't heard me for the past 30 minutes, that's definitely what I think the trend is amongst all regulators. Banning types of AI, for instance, AI facial recognition databases are banned for surveillance and in other cases considered high risk. So definitely not targeting the right aid case with that, but potentially targeting the right aid case with that. And then using FAIR, you can evaluate the risks of such technologies being deployed within your organization in order to explain why certain technologies are within your own organization's risk tolerance or outside of it. And then Arun, I know you kind of have like a really good understanding of Article 15. So if you want to jump into those specifics, I think that'd be helpful too.
Yeah, definitely. Before I go into Article 15, which is security specific, but things like we were talking about robocall and also high risk ones, like things like they paid attention to use cases like resume sorting, for example. They call that as high risk. Or they want, basically they do not want AI to sort and pick resumes that would an organization would be filtering before they actually call the candidate. They want somebody to actually look at those resumes is an interesting thing to observe in the act. So anyway, so yes, being security professional, I paid attention to parts of the cybersecurity, which is basically Article 15 as part of EU Act, where they have 5 points primarily, starting from very cybersecurity kind of paying attention. Then as Brandon mentioned earlier, the second one in that Article 15 is actually to look at benchmarking your models and then watching the models, not only measuring them at deployment, but also continuously monitoring the drift of the model and logging the actual inference requests and responses and making sure you have a good understanding of how your models are overall doing to the point that basically you need to be able to have an audit of your overall model posture, and then they go into expectations around your model's reliability, having redundancy around models, high availability of the models, which you kind of practice as part of any any standard deployment practices, but here it is an expectation as part of when you as a developer of the model or as a provider of the model, or as you deploy this model under other applications, they would expect you to have considerations into things like high availability, right? And then they go into specifics of and Brandon touched on this also, like models are continuously learning. What that means is in your traditional applications deployment in the past, when you deploy, they are pretty static. You did your quality testing, and then from there on, as other applications integrated to those standard deployments, they fairly do same thing as when they were deployed a year ago, right? In case of AI models, if you have feedback loop data or reinforcement data or even online learning data, these models need to be continuously monitored for feedback loops and bias kind of feeding into those models. That's another area that they, in the Article 15, they clearly call out. Last but not the least, they talk about overall, in addition to your traditional cybersecurity, paying attention to adversarial machine learning, which may be pretty new for a lot of security teams out there. Be it confidentiality attacks on your model, can they do model evasion, or is there a model poisoning possibility, and then make the model do things that you didn't expect at the deployment time, right? So it goes into pretty detailed and deep. Overall, the controls that are necessary and risk assessment that is necessary may not be that intimidating as the list of risks that are out there. Sometimes you may need to have special controls in place. Sometimes it may be even traditional cyber controls, but paying attention to Article 15 is going to be super important for organizations that are hoping to comply with the EU Act.
Yeah. And that was a great explanation there, Arun, of the Article 15 requirements, which again is where we're probably highly interested, because a lot of us are cybersecurity experts first and risk experts second. So Brandon, do you have anything you wanted to add there before we move on to materiality, or are there any questions about this?
Yeah, I was going to add just a couple things. First, from a scoping perspective, it's probably worth noting the EU AI Act, it's about all AI. It's not just Gen AI.
Yeah.
It applies, and don't quote me on this, but it's for people who build and deploy, or providers and developers, AI models specifically for within the EU. So if they're marketed or planned to be used within the EU, that's when it falls into the scope of the EU AI Act. So it may not be every company or every deployment or every organization falls within this, but that's something, do your own research, talk to your own legal team, make sure you understand the scope of the legislation, and as you're evaluating applicability to your own organization. And then the last point I wanted to make on this is I'm really proud of the drafters of this act for taking a risk-based approach in how they are assessing and evaluating AI. The fact that they're placing different requirements on high-risk AI implementations versus low-risk ones, it's showing an evolution in the industry and how we talk about risk and how we think about how we should be protecting things. It's up to us as cyber risk professionals and cyber risk quantification to place more guidance and elaborate, extend that framework. So beyond just saying high, medium, low, let's see if we can actually quantify that and put defensible frameworks around why we think these are high and under what conditions, and really kind of extending and showcasing our power as cyber risk professionals.
Agree on all of your points. So I will, I didn't see anything come in, so I'll move on, and Brandon's going to share a little bit about materiality of model development risk with us.
Sure. So there's this new SEC rule that we talked about actually at FairCon last year. It's not redefining materiality, but it's certainly bringing it more into the light. It's emphasizing its importance. And specifically when we're talking about reportable breaches, reportable events. And so, when we're thinking about these, there's this whole material incident that you have to disclose via an 8K. There's that 4-day window, but the requirements of what is material, there's a lot of conversation around how we set that threshold. And I think quantifying AI risks is a way of answering that materiality question of saying when we cross the threshold and figuring out what we think is a material incident. And so, like, if we go back to the Rite Aid case, for example, the fact that their AI software is potentially biased, when they discovered that internally, likely they would have required some kind of an 8K disclosure. And if they had a proper risk management and governance process from the beginning, they probably would not have been banned for its use for 5 years. They would have figured that out and responded and handled it appropriately. So, this is certainly something that organizations need to think through. Just up on the slide here, we just have some examples of AI risks that might manifest throughout the model development lifecycle. Some of these, aren't going to manifest until after you've deployed a model, after you've, stood it up and exposed it to customers or users. And some of them are things that you need to think about during the training and build out phase, including, privacy violations and data use. But I think one of the questions that we really need to think through from an AI materiality and AI risk perspective is, who is it material to, and what kind of a risk are we talking about? And so are we talking about the company that's building the model, or the companies that are hosting it, the users interacting with the model, society at large? And so this is, this theme, what I'm getting at the bottom here is different types of risks could be material. With the Rite Aid case, we had this bias that was introduced by the model, and maybe that was exacerbating these social and societal problems around biases. And, maybe that's what caused it to cross some materiality threshold. If it's a privacy risk, our materiality threshold might be very different, and we might be talking about the number of users, data that was exposed, the level of data, all those data sensitivity classification type conversations. And from a cybersecurity perspective, we could have conversations about how we've secured the model, how we've secured model weights, the intellectual property or crown jewels around it, or the product integration risks. But I think another interesting question that maybe people are not necessarily considering is how much these models are enabling adversarial activities. And so, I called this out in examples of AI risk, but if you're standing up a model and it allows attackers to conduct more efficient phishing attacks, or you realize that your AI model is enabling denial of service attacks against other companies, do you report that as a materiality risk? Is that something that crosses your threshold? And so figuring out when these things happen, defining parameters around that, and then quantifying and saying, this is when I've crossed my thresholds, that's something that's going to require a lot of work, and something that I think, as a research organization, we're certainly interested in trying to put some thought around.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I will say that last question that Brandon asked has not been answered yet. So, and that's an area where we're hoping as a work group to work with, the industry to kind of figure out what the answer to that question is. And I saw a question come in: can you categorize these risks according to whom the risk is material to? And I'd say, yes, we could spend time doing that right now. But I'd say depending on the specific scope of your use cases, that question will look different. These are just high-level examples of AI risks from an organization's perspective. If you're looking for a little bit more in-depth analysis of these, we do have the blog post, the Fair Air Playbook, and then Databricks has a very, very comprehensive DAS framework that jumps into more specifics around what these risks look like, what controls you can put in place, and to who they likely apply as well. So are there any other questions around materiality for now? If not, I can kind of open this up to broader, just AI related questions with risk management. Okay. So again, questions, what questions do you guys have around AI risk within your organization, and how you can use FAIR to address it? It says, one risk that is not addressed is permissible use of data and data transformation by AI. How material are these risks to the team? And I would say, for my perspective on that, and then Brandon, I'll pass it over to you, is just that's going to depend on your use case and the data involved. So I work with the healthcare industry, so a lot of the use cases that I'm looking at involve PHI, and that's going to be a very, very, very different picture than someone who's potentially using box photos to create an imaging platform for AI. It's going to depend on your use case, the type of data involved, and what you're trying to do with it. That would be sort of my starting point, is trying to contextualize what you're doing with it. But Brandon, I'll let you answer too.
Yeah, so data is a very tricky one when it comes to AI, because AI models and model development is a very data hungry process. And a lot of these product teams and model development functions are just going to grab as much data as they can possibly get a hand on and feed it in, because the more you feed it, the more robust the solution ends up being. But from a cybersecurity perspective, from a risk management perspective, those are the sorts of things that make me very nervous when I see product teams going out and just saying, oh yeah, I'll just dump the whole database in. That's great. So data custodianship, data lineage, metadata management, all of those sorts of things become so much more important when you're talking about AI models and the data risk within it. So beyond just kind of privacy concerns, the security of the data and understanding and maintaining confidentiality and integrity of lineage and connectivity, tracing between features and models building upon models, and understanding how all of that data flows through. It can be a very complex ecosystem to manage, but a potentially very risky one if you manage it poorly.
Yeah, and I could say, if you have a data governance problem today, and then you try to tackle AI, that is probably not the best use of your time. All right, I saw a few more questions come in too. Sorry, Arun, did you have something you wanted to add there too?
No, I was going to read this question, and then maybe Brandon can address this. In terms of materiality, does it aggregate across multiple incidents in a given time frame? Example, repeated ransomware or DDoS? I would say yes, but Brandon, what do you think?
Yeah, what the materiality thresholds are not necessarily clearly defined here. It's kind of up to each organization to say that, yeah, this combination of events is what crosses the threshold. I think I would tend to agree. If you can link events together, or there's a repeated pattern, and that's what allows it to cross the threshold. I mean, the same sort of thing we see with like any sort of risk aggregation. If we see repeated events that are all related or stemming from the same kind of source, we would bubble it up into a bigger risk, and that's when you might cross your materiality threshold. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say like FAIR helps you do that, right? So like if you can actually quantify and get a loss event frequency and a loss magnitude, and you're speaking in like dollars and cents, it's much easier to understand what your risk threshold is than having a bunch of medium incidents that happen to your organization and trying to understand if that's material or not. Another question came in is, can you please talk about AI risk in the context of cryptocurrency and the potential shift of payments or CBDC? I personally can't talk to that. I don't know if Brandon or Arun, you guys have a position on that one.
No, I do not.
But we'd love to hear from you on it and your position.
AI risk in the context of cryptocurrency. Are we talking about AI trading or AI management of cryptocurrency? I think I'm struggling to understand the question here.
Yeah. And I know we have quite a few more that came in, but I know we're right at the end of time. I wanted to share two things. I really do appreciate all these questions. And if you had a question that went unanswered, please feel free to email the email that I threw in the attendees chat with it, and we're happy to kind of provide some additional context. Reach out to us on LinkedIn as well. I wanted to share we have a resources page in the slide that's going to have our AI playbook. It's going to have the DAS framework that we talked about, some information that informs some of our research from the Berryville Institute. And then Databricks has had like a legacy of AI. It's not just generative AI, it's machine learning in general. So just some links to resources from that perspective. And then I'll give Luke like a quick second to talk about FairCon.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you so much for joining and for everybody's engagement and questions during the session today. My takeaway is that this, and this isn't surprising, continues to be a very new and hot topic in our group and in our membership at the Institute. So you can expect a lot more content being published on this in the blog, via emails, and as well as some more webinars like this, where we do some presentations, but we also have more of an open discussion forum as well. And as we continue to professionalize this group, and maybe we do something that's not on 24, and it can be more discussion where it's more Zoom or something like that. So ideas I'm taking away from this for sure. And I want to thank our panelists, Arun, Brandon, and Jackie, of course, today for being here and for answering everybody's questions. Like Jackie said, there will be more on this specifically at FairCon in October. Tickets are now available for the conference. Our early bird pricing ends at the end of May. So more information on our website, and you can purchase your seat there at FairCon, and our full agenda is being published soon. We have collected a lot of the questions in the chat and in the Q&A today, so we'll be taking those back, the ones we didn't get to, and working on those to be making sure that we're able to answer them. I will also be posting the slide deck and the recording in the member resource library later today or tomorrow, the member resource library of the FAIR Institute. So with that, I want to be aware of everybody's time today and really want to thank everybody for coming out and for participating, and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar or at an in-person event soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.